My name is Hannah Kim, but I was born Park Ji-Hye in Seoul, South Korea, and at 6 months old I was adopted by white American parents who changed my name, brought me to rural Wisconsin where I grew up as the only Asian person in my entire school, and raised me with the philosophy that love is colorblind, and that cultural connection to Korea was unnecessary because I was fully American now. A belief system that served my parents' comfort but left me culturally severed, racially isolated, and completely unprepared for the racism I would face from a white community that would never see me as one of them despite my cultural whiteness. At 26, I'm in the painful process of learning Korean language and culture that should have been my birthright but was systematically denied through an adoption that treated my Korean identity as expendable obstacle to be erased rather than essential part of who I am that required preservation and cultivation for my healthy development as person navigating America with Asian face but no cultural tools, racial mirrors, or connection to the community that shares my appearance but not my socialization. The adoption narrative that shaped my childhood was the sanitized rescue story, that I had been abandoned, that my birth mother couldn't keep me, that adoption saved me from orphanage or poverty, and that I should be grateful to my adoptive parents for giving me a better life in America. The narrative positioned adoption as purely positive event with no losses, only gains, erasing the trauma of separation from birth family, culture, language, and country while treating my Korean identity as irrelevant to my well-being and development. The gratitude narrative made questioning adoption or expressing any grief about losses feel like betrayal of parents who saved me. The name erasure happened immediately when my adoptive parents decided that Park Ji-Hye was too difficult for Americans to pronounce and gave me the English name Hannah, eliminating my Korean name without preserving it even as middle name. The name change was presented as practical accommodation rather than cultural violence, but it represented first of many erasures where my Korean identity was sacrificed for my adoptive parents and community's comfort. I didn't learn my birth name until adolescence when I found my adoption papers, discovering that I had been someone else before becoming Hannah. The racial isolation was profound and damaging as I grew up in a rural Wisconsin town of 5,000 people where I was literally the only Asian person in my school and one of perhaps 3 Asian people in the entire community. I had no racial mirrors, no one who looked like me, no one who could understand what it meant to have Asian face in all-white environment, no one who could teach me how to navigate racism or provide reflection that my appearance was normal rather than exotic anomaly requiring explanation. The colorblind parenting philosophy that my adoptive parents embraced meant they actively avoided discussing race, refused to acknowledge that my Asian appearance would affect how others treated me, and provided no education about racism, Korean culture, or tools for developing healthy racial identity. When I experienced racist bullying at school, classmates pulling their eyes into slants, calling me chink, asking if I ate dog, my parents told me to ignore it and that kids are just curious, failing to recognize it as racism or to protect me from racial violence they didn't understand because of their whiteness. The cultural void in my upbringing meant I had no connection to Korean language, food, traditions, history, or community. My parents made no effort to connect me with Korean culture, other Korean adoptees, or Asian American community, treating my Korean heritage as past that had been left behind rather than present that required cultivation. I grew up eating only American food, celebrating only American holidays, speaking only English, and having no framework for understanding the Korean part of my identity beyond the face I saw in mirror that looked nothing like my white parents or siblings. The family photographs disconnect was stark and painful as I looked at family pictures showing my white parents, my white biological siblings, and me, the brown face standing out in every photo, the visual evidence that I didn't genetically belong despite being loved. The photos documented my adoption and difference rather than seamlessly including me as just another family member, and the visual reminder of my otherness was constant throughout childhood even as my family insisted race didn't matter. The identity confusion intensified during adolescence when I became more aware of my difference and began questioning who I was, American by culture and socialization but Asian by appearance, belonging to white family but not recognized as white by broader society, having no connection to Korea but being constantly identified as Korean by others based on my face. The confusion created crisis about authenticity and belonging that I had no resources to resolve because my parents couldn't guide me through racial identity development they had never experienced. The racism navigation absence meant I had no tools for handling the racism I experienced because my white parents couldn't teach me strategies they had never needed to develop. When I faced discrimination, microaggressions, or fetishization, I had no framework for understanding what was happening or how to respond, leaving me vulnerable and unprepared for racial hostility that my white cultural socialization had given me no ability to navigate. The adoptee community discovery happened in college when I finally encountered other Korean adoptees through student organizations and online forums, and realized that my experiences of isolation, identity confusion, and grief about cultural loss were nearly universal among transracial adoptees. Meeting other adoptees who shared experiences of growing up culturally white but racially Asian validated that the identity crisis wasn't individual pathology but predictable outcome of transracial adoption that severed us from culture while placing us in white families and communities unprepared to support our racial identity development. The birth family search began when I was 23 and finally felt ready to confront what had been taken from me, hiring a search agency in Korea to try to locate my birth mother and learn about the circumstances of my adoption. The search was emotionally overwhelming as I grieved the family I had been separated from, mourned the culture and language that should have been mine, and confronted the adoption industry's practices that prioritized white American adoptive parents' desires for children over Korean children's needs to remain connected to family, culture, and country when possible. The birth mother reunion happened after 18 months of searching when I learned that my birth mother hadn't abandoned me as I had been told but had been a single mother in a society with no support for unmarried mothers and had been pressured by social workers to relinquish me for adoption to America. Meeting her and learning that she had grieved my loss for 25 years, had always wondered about me, and had been given no information about me after adoption shattered the rescue narrative I had been raised with and forced recognition that my adoption had involved loss and trauma for both of us, not just gain. The language barrier with my birth mother was devastating as we couldn't communicate directly because I spoke no Korean and she spoke limited English, requiring translators for every conversation and highlighting how adoption had stolen my ability to speak with my own mother in our shared language. The loss of language was particularly painful because it was permanent damage that could never be fully repaired. I could learn Korean as adult but would never have the native fluency I would have had if I had grown up speaking it, another theft that adoption had caused. The grief emergence was profound and complicated as I mourned the Korean identity I should have had, the family I had been separated from, the language I should have spoken, the culture that should have shaped me, and the person I would have been if adoption hadn't severed me from my roots. The grief was complicated by guilt about feeling sad when my adoptive parents had given me a better life, by confusion about how to integrate newfound birth family connections with existing adoptive family relationships, and by anger at adoption system that had treated my cultural identity as expendable. The adoptive parent conflict intensified as I began expressing grief about adoption losses and criticism of how my parents had raised me without cultural connection, and they responded defensively that they had done their best, and that I was being ungrateful for the life they had provided. Their inability to acknowledge that love wasn't enough, that colorblindness had harmed me, and that adoption had involved real losses that deserved recognition created painful divide between us that threatened relationship I still valued despite its problems. The therapy that helped me process the accumulated adoption trauma was with Dr. Grace Park, a Korean-American therapist who specialized in working with adoptees and understood that transracial adoption created specific identity challenges and losses that required validation rather than dismissal as typical adjustment issues. She helped me understand that my grief was appropriate response to what had been taken from me, that cultural connection was essential need rather than optional extra, and that my adoptive parents' love, however genuine, didn't compensate for cultural erasure and racial isolation I had experienced. Transracial adoption severs children from their culture, language, family, and racial community while placing them in families and communities unprepared to support their racial identity development or protect them from racism, Dr. Park explained during one of our sessions. The colorblind parenting approach that many white adoptive parents use treats race and culture as irrelevant when they're actually central to healthy identity development for children of color. Growing up as only Asian person in all-white environment without cultural connection or racial mirrors creates identity confusion, vulnerability to racism, and cultural loss that has lasting psychological impacts. Your grief about what was taken from you is valid, and the adoption system that prioritized your parents' desire for child over your need for cultural connection and racial community failed you. She helped me understand that integrating my Korean identity required active work to learn language, culture, and history that had been denied me, that this work was reclamation rather than appropriation despite my cultural whiteness, and that developing connection to Korean and Korean American community was essential for healing even though I would always be marked as outsider, too American for Korea, too Asian for white America, existing in adoptee-specific liminal space. The Korean language learning began as an adult project that was frustratingly difficult because I had missed the developmental window when language acquisition is easiest, but was also deeply meaningful as I slowly gained ability to communicate with my birth mother without translators and to access Korean culture more directly. Each word I learned felt like reclaiming small piece of what had been stolen, even as I grieved that I would never have the fluency that should have been my birthright. The Korean culture exploration included learning to cook Korean food, participating in Korean American community events, studying Korean history, and developing understanding of culture that had been completely absent from my upbringing. The exploration was complicated by my obvious outsider status in Korean spaces where my lack of language fluency and cultural knowledge marked me as American despite my Korean face, creating another form of not quite belonging that characterized adoptee experience. The adoptee activism that emerged from my experiences includes speaking about the realities of transracial adoption that adoption agencies don't disclose to prospective adoptive parents, advocating for reforms including requirements that transracial adoptive parents commit to preserving children's cultural connections and racial identity development, and supporting other adoptees who are navigating similar identity crises and grief about cultural loss. The research engagement with adoption scholars studying outcomes for transracial adoptees helps document patterns of identity struggles, mental health challenges, and the specific factors that predict better or worse adjustment. The research increasingly shows that cultural connection and racial community matter profoundly for adoptees' well-being, contradicting colorblind parenting philosophies that minimize race and culture. The adoptive parent education work involves helping prospective transracial adoptive parents understand that adopting child of color requires lifelong commitment to supporting that child's racial identity development, actively cultivating cultural connections, learning about racism and how to protect children from it, and providing racial mirrors through community connections rather than raising children in racially isolated environments. Many white adoptive parents resist this education, preferring colorblind approach that centers their comfort over children's needs. The birth-family integration has been gradual and complicated process as I develop relationship with my Korean birth mother and extended family while maintaining relationship with my American adoptive parents, navigating complicated loyalties and the reality that I have two families who are fundamentally different and will likely never fully integrate. I've learned to hold complexity rather than choosing between them, but the ongoing navigation is emotionally demanding. Today, I identify as Korean American adoptee, a specific identity category that acknowledges both my Korean heritage and my American upbringing while recognizing that adoption creates unique experiences different from either immigrants or other Korean Americans. I'm working on writing a memoir about transracial adoption from adoptee perspective, challenging the dominant narratives that center adoptive parents' experiences and erase adoptees' losses and ongoing struggles. The future includes continuing Korean language learning, deepening connections with birth family, participating in adoptee community organizing, and working toward adoption reform that would prioritize children's cultural connections and racial identity development over adults' desires to adopt. I'm also committed to ensuring that if I have children, they will have connection to Korean culture and community that I was denied. Key resources and solutions that made the difference. Therapy with culturally competent providers who specialize in adoption trauma helps process grief about cultural loss and identity confusion specific to transracial adoptees. Adoptee community organizations provide connection with others who share specific experiences of cultural severing and racial isolation in white families. Birth family search services help adoptees who want to connect with biological family and learn about adoption circumstances often different from rescue narratives. Korean language and culture classes provide opportunities for adult cultural reclamation even though it can't fully replace what was lost through adoption. Adoption reform advocacy pushes for requirements that transracial adoptive parents commit to preserving cultural connections and supporting racial identity development. Research on transracial adoption outcomes documents patterns of identity struggles and provides evidence supporting cultural connection as essential rather than optional. Adoptive parent education helps prospective parents understand that transracial adoption requires lifelong commitment to supporting children's racial and cultural needs. Adoptee storytelling and writing challenges dominant adoption narratives and creates space for complex truths about losses and ongoing struggles. Today, when adoption agencies promote transracial adoption using colorblind rhetoric claiming that love is all you need, I respond that I was loved but that love alone wasn't enough to prevent identity crisis, protect me from racism my white parents couldn't navigate, or compensate for cultural erasure that severed me from language, family, and heritage that were mine by birth. Transracial adoption without cultural connection is identity theft disguised as rescue, and adoptees deserve to have our complex truths acknowledged rather than being silenced by gratitude narratives that serve adoptive parents comfort while erasing our losses and ongoing struggles with belonging nowhere fully.